All right, greetings. Welcome to this video. I have some great news. I just passed my FAA Part 101 test, and I did so with kind of an astounding 92%. Yes, I'm super pumped. I actually didn't think I was going to do that well. I was kind of thinking, started off with the test 70, 75, maybe 80 if I were lucky, but no, I got a 92%. Super pumped about that. I just took it the other day and things are relatively fresh in my mind, and I wanted to make a video to share some of my reflections and surprises about the test itself. Also how I kind of approached the studying for this test, because the FAA Remote Pilot Study Guide only gets you so far. There's a lot of other supplemental study materials out there. So I'm going to put links down in the description below for all of those, including some that I developed myself, like some basic flashcards that at least get you kind of a good start, and also a condensed study guide, because the original study guide is around 80 something pages, more or less. And I have gone through that and condensed, kind of extracted all those main ideas, not the visuals and some of the more detailed definitions and explanations. So you definitely don't want to replace it with the original study guide, but read the original study guide first, and then you can study with a more lightweight version of the study guide, if that makes sense. So before I get too into detail, let me share with you some reflections about the test itself. I didn't really pay too much attention in terms of the format of the test. In fact, I wasn't quite even sure if it was going to be computer-based or paper-based or what. So I kind of went in cold to the test itself, and just can talk a little bit about that. It ended up being a computer-based test, and when I walked into this test center and I scheduled this online, and there's videos that will show you how to schedule that. It's pretty simple, but they give you basically you got to check in. They give you some earplugs. You got to show your ID, and you can read what constitutes a proper ID. I basically showed up with my driver's license and my passport for my two forms of ID. They gave me this testing booklet, which I'll mention, and this booklet was filled with images that I thought I kind of had to memorize as I studied for this test, but it ended up actually being in this booklet. So I didn't really have to study for that. I didn't have to memorize certain things. So I can definitely talk about that. They gave me a dry erase marker, or excuse me, a wet erase marker, and a clear, transparent piece of paper, one that you put on the old school projectors. And that is for, so that you don't actually write with your pencil or on the actual booklet or in the actual booklet. So if you need to make markings on your maps and whatnot, you have a wet erase marker and an eraser to do that. They did provide a calculator. I ended up bringing my own. I used my own. That was no problem. I had to take my lid off the calculator and check that as well. They did not offer me a magnifying glass, and that was kind of a problem. So when you sign up to take the test originally, they're going to ask if you are requesting any accommodations. Not being able to read small print, I don't know if most people think of that as accommodation, but if I could rewind the clock, I would have added something like, I have a hard time reading very small print, so please provide a magnifying glass. That would have been a really nice accommodation. I maybe thought they would have done that. Some of those sectional maps, for example, you're really kind of squinting under fluorescent light. So something to think about. They provided 2 pencils and a piece of scratch paper, a singular piece of scratch paper with my name on it. So as far as the test booklet goes, there's a lot of jumping around. You kind of log into the computer, and your proctor will be there helping you, put in this special code, and then you basically start. I'll talk more about that in a second, but a lot of the test questions said, for example, refer to figure 2, which was, I believe, page 2 in the booklet. There was a correspondence there. So, question 2 maybe referred you to figure 14, which is on page 14, and then question 3 had you refer to figure 80, which was like on page 80 or something like that. So you're constantly kind of losing a little bit of time for each question, bouncing around in this booklet, which wasn't a big deal. I found that the test 2 hours they gave you was ample time for the most part to answer the questions and then go back and focus on the ones that were more difficult and then to do a kind of a final review. I finished with about 7 minutes technically left on the clock. But the most difficult parts for me, I found, were the remote ID sections. That's relatively new as of 2021, as I understand it. So if you're watching this and you haven't taken your initial test yet, go, and this is not in the original study guide or a lot of the materials that I found because it's so new. So there are some YouTube videos that specifically teach you about remote ID and also the categories 1 through 4 for nighttime flying and flying over people. Those were not as fresh in my mind because I just kind of had figured that out, I don't know, about a week prior to taking my test. So, and there's a lot of dense information within those. So I didn't do as well on that as I wanted to. There were a lot of category 1, category 2, 3, and 4 questions that were pretty specific, and that was probably the most challenging for me. The airspace categories were pretty big, and I had the advantage of studying for this test a couple of months leading up to me actually taking it. So I had identified that as being the most challenging part, especially Class E airspace. There's a lot of nuances and how that looks on a sectional map, and quite frankly, random numbers associated with it, 700 AGL versus 1200 AGL. So that was definitely an area that I struggled with, not during the test. I felt pretty good about it, but one that I had identified and really put in some time to understand the concepts behind that and also how it transfers to a sectional map. And there's YouTube videos that show you how to do that, and it help you explain that. So CTAF was actually a pretty big part of my test. There were several questions asking me to identify the CTAF symbol on a sectional map, or which frequency I would use if I needed to monitor the airspace. So that was kind of unexpectedly easy, and there seemed to be a couple of questions, 2 or 3 questions about that. So, but there was really a full range of questions according to the Airman Certification Standards that they put forth. There were questions from all of these categories, lots of questions pertaining to sectional charts. Yes, there were questions on interpreting meters and TAFs. One thing I didn't mention when you first sit down, talking about a computer-based test, the test was actually well designed, but because before you even started your 2 hours and your 60-question test, the computer software had you do this pre-test, and they give you 5 minutes to answer some like random easy questions, like how many letters are there in the alphabet or how many states are there in the U.S., and you it's a time to get comfortable with the interface of the test. So do you click the next button? How can you bookmark a question to come back to later? How do you exit the test? So that was really nice. It was built in, and it was prior to the 2-hour start time for the test. So that's worthy of mention too in terms of the testing format. You can bookmark difficult questions to return to later, and you'll learn how to do that within those 5-minute pre-test that you take, because that was pretty important. Some tests or some questions were super easy and you felt really confident about it, and then others were more difficult, and you definitely didn't want to burn too much time there at that moment, so you can bookmark it and then go to the next question, and then when you're kind of done with all the questions, you can come back to the more difficult ones. So that was a strategy that was really helpful for me. I mentioned 2 hours was sufficient to complete all 60 test items, and to also return to those difficult bookmarked questions, to really focus and work hard on those, and then to review all 60 answers relatively quickly to confirm that I'm relatively content with my answers. But you still have to move quickly. 60 questions over 2 hours is about 2 minutes per question. And again, some questions were like, okay, I got, you read this and pretty quickly, and you're like, okay, I probably spent 20 seconds on that question. So, and others you'll spend, a few minutes, or probably not that long. A couple of minutes is probably the max. I found the test, when you kind of walk into the test center, it was pretty intimidating. I was suffering from some test anxiety because it's this lockdown, video recorded. You got to check in your phone and your wallet and your keys in this sealed bag, at least where I was testing. You check in with your IDs and whatnot, and that's all contributes to test anxiety. And it's an expensive test too, right? At the making of this video, it was $175 for this test, and it's high stakes. So you fail, that money's just gone. You got to pony up another, $175 to do it again. So there was a lot of pressure, and I felt that, especially sitting down and the first few questions, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm in over my head. Like, what did I do? These questions don't look anything like my practice questions that I had taken, on a variety of different websites and apps and things. So the test really does measure your understanding of the concepts, right? So they don't copy and paste these practice test questions. They rephrase them. And so you have to anticipate that and make sure you're asking that question, answering the question, why does this concept exist, right? Not just the answers that you take. And that was challenging because when you're taking these practice tests and you maybe take it again later, your mind kind of remembers the answer. So you're like, oh yeah, I got this. And you go immediately to that answer and you build this false sense of confidence. So you really need to take the time when you practice studying for the test, asking yourself the question, do I understand this, right? Do I understand the reason why this answer is what it is? And do I understand why the other answers are not, right? Because if you don't understand it, you need to flag it and then make a note of it, go to a different YouTube video, type in your question that you have, and see if you can figure out what that is. So I approached this, I studied pretty hard. But so, there was a day where I didn't know anything at all about remote, the study guide or anything. I had no idea. Just some guy who bought a drone and was interested in taking the Part 101, Part 107 test. So how did I approach studying for this? I studied really hard at first. I went through the full study guide that was published by the FAA, and I read it and I annotated, with a marker, a different colored marker. I circled, I underlined, and really tried to just get through that. That was my first challenge, quite frankly, and spent, a couple of hours doing that, as I mentioned before. And then I hopped on YouTube, and there's a lot of great kind of introductory, comprehensive YouTube videos, and some of them are quite long. So spending a couple of hours with that and trying to understand and follow, and then maybe watching it again was pretty helpful for me. Once some basic YouTube videos and the study guide were kind of synthesized and processed in my mind for one time through, or maybe two times through, then I kind of kicked it back in terms of intensity and, studied like 20 minutes a day or so, randomly going from practice tests to more YouTube videos and looking at the airman certification standards and all those other documents that they publish at the end of the official study guide. And, there's a lot of like military jargon and acronyms and what the heck is this? And you open up this document, it's like 700 pages. You're like, what? So I have to study 700 pages in addition to the study guide? But yeah, kind of. So the idea is that you're familiar with all of these things. Some of them not so much in detail, right? Like there's a lot of concepts that are specifically for manned aircraft pilots, right, when they're studying, and they won't really apply to the remote pilot so much. But you'll get to know some of that as you go through the study guide and watch some of those introductory YouTube videos, as I mentioned. When you feel like you have generally a strong base or foundation of knowledge, that is the time where I scheduled my test. And I scheduled still, 2 or 3 weeks out from that point. So I built a really strong foundation, was feeling pretty good. And there were waves. There were times where I felt confident and then kind of lost my confidence. Oh gosh, do I really understand this or not? I didn't do so hot on this last thing. Or where did this piece of information come from? I had no idea. This is something I needed to know. There were several moments there that I kind of experienced. But anyway, I scheduled the test 2 to 3 weeks out, and then really continued studying frequently every day. I wanted it to stay as fresh as possible in my mind. There wasn't a week where I went by that I didn't study, right? Where concepts would need to be completely relearned or whatnot. And then the 3 days leading up to the test, I crammed really hard. I took it, I would say, pretty seriously. Crammed really hard, and maybe a couple hours in the morning and a couple hours before bed is what I would kind of say. Just reviewing all of my notes and some of those important YouTube videos, going through the study guide again. And I did save a 60-question practice test that I found that I hadn't taken yet to the day prior of my test. And that was helpful. It gave me some confidence. It helped review that the full range of what you might expect on the test. Again, I'll put links in the description below if you want to check out some of those sources and sites that I found. As I mentioned, another challenge was figuring out the new updates from the FAA, like the remote ID and flying over people in night flying, not reflected in the study guides. And again, you don't have to memorize everything. There are some things that you have to memorize, but there are other concepts that you don't. They're going to be provided for you in the test booklet that they provide when you sit down to take the test. So with that said, I'm going to just go over briefly some of the sources that I used. And also I'm just going to spend the rest of the video, if you just want to learn some, what I would consider some random facts or some random pieces of information that I have on my notes, my handwritten notes mostly, things that I kind of came across randomly when I took this test or the practice test or this practice test, or watched this YouTube video or went through this document. Some kind of helpful ideas for you. So if you're interested, stick around and you can maybe write down some of these things that you hear me say. Now, of course, I'm not an authority or pilot experienced, I would say. I did pass my test, so I have some credibility, but I might not phrase things, correctly or whatnot, but I'll try my best and give you kind of what I had and what I think might be helpful for you. So we'll get started here. I mentioned the full study guide and also the reduced study guide that I created myself. Definitely go through the full study guide the first time, annotate, try to understand as much as you possibly can. And then you can use and travel with, if you're like going out of town or something and you don't want to lug this 80-pound or 80-page document with you. It's not 80 pounds. Well, maybe. There's a lot. 80-page document with you. You can travel with the lighter version. Also, study guide or flashcards to be used as a supplemental study material. That was I think really helpful. Just some of those memorized facts, some of those basic numbers, for example, that was helpful. You can cut those up if you want, or just print them off and have them next to you and look at those frequently. Practice tests, I mentioned that before. There are a lot of them out there. I never paid $1 for a practice test. There were several that I found either on an app or on a website. And the idea is that you don't do the same test like every other day, right? Because then you're going to start just recognizing it. But do one test first and then go to a completely different source and do another practice test. And then maybe by the time next week or 2 weeks roll around, depending on how much time you have to study for this, when you go back and take that same practice test again, some things you'll find familiar, but for the most part, you've reset your memory, and your brain, at least mine, didn't recognize everything. It was like taking the same test again, right? And so I was still forced to think about these concepts in new ways. My brain was less likely to have remembered the answer, and I was more likely to ask myself the question, why is this, right? Without my memory influencing my answer, if that makes sense. All the documents listed at the end of the FAA study guide for this test, for example, the part 47, part 48, the registration pieces, circulars that talk about reporting wildlife, and the weight and balance handbook, the pilot's handbook. I would say yes. Bad news. You got to go through all of that. I have provided summaries of what all of these are at the end of my condensed study guide that I created. So I opened up each of these and just kind of wrote a little couple sentences of a summary of what you can expect to find on this. But so that's maybe some good news. The bad news is you have to still open these documents, and by the time you take your test, by the time that day comes around, you should probably be familiar with some of those, a lot, if not all of them. The degree to which you need to be familiar will vary, right? As I mentioned before, there are some things that are more for pilots, for manned aircraft, and other things that you'll definitely need to know for the remote pilot part 107 test. So, but you're going to start getting a feel for that as you do your, go through your study guide and watch these YouTube videos. You're going to get a feel for what you need, and the practice tests for what you need to kind of start focusing on, and then some of the less non-essential information. The memorized numbers like 0.04 blood alcohol level and max flying, height 400 AGL, those are numbers that I would say are pretty easy, because just a matter of memorization, right? Not a lot of thought. I mean, yeah, you need to ask yourself why, and some exceptions as to the rules. But for the most part, some of those numbers are pretty straightforward. And I found that to be easier, right? Because it's a black and white thing. You memorize it or not. And there are a lot of numbers that will jump out at you in your study materials. Airspace, as I mentioned earlier in the video, was pretty hard. I took a lot of time to make sure I was matching those concepts that I learned to the sectional charts. And the secret there, I think, is doing that every day or every other day, right? Keeping it fresh, revisiting it often, and spending many days. You can't learn it in a day. Well, you probably can, but I couldn't. And I found by the time the test rolled around and I had a couple of months of practice with this, it was really ingrained in my long-term memory. And I felt really fluent in looking at a sectional chart and easily being able to identify, oh, this is Class C airspace versus Class E airspace, and I need authorization or not, those kinds of things. So that would be a tip. Do it every day. Keep it fresh. Watch YouTube videos. YouTube videos there's lots of great ones out there that explain all these concepts, right? And it's a very visual way to do so. And if you're looking at that every day, it's gonna start to click. It's gonna start to click. And then the handwritten notes is I mentioned a form of annotation when you're actually watching something and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Or you're taking a practice and you're like, oh, I didn't know that. Make a little note of it. Write it down on a piece of paper and keep it with your study guide. When you write something, your brain is engaging with it, right? And also there's some organizational memory happening. If you write it down on your piece of paper and you go back and study that and read it, it's going to be not only more familiar, but it's going to be more accessible when your brain tries to recall that, because you can almost see I don't have a photographic memory, but I found myself almost thinking about this piece of paper during the test that I took. Oh yeah, this question, I wrote this down in the middle of my page, and you can almost see that paper. It's a great kind of test taking strategy when you are facing some of these questions. So I think that's important. Have a place where you're handwriting these notes and you're not just reading it, for example. If you're actually writing it down, that's gonna, I think, help with accessibility of when it comes time to recall this information later. So we'll go over some other random items starting at this point. I know this is kind of a long video. Feel free to bail anytime, but some random facts that I thought were helpful for me. Let's go ahead and get started with those. All right, so we're going to start off with thinking about night illusions. I recently watched a video from, I believe it was the Pilot Institute. They have some really wonderful in-depth videos. I highly recommend you drop by their channel and check things out. Type your questions into the YouTube and look for the YouTube search box and look for videos put forth by them. But one thing, talking about night illusions that they went over, there are 4 nighttime illusions that I was familiar with. And I found this other document that actually listed a few more night illusions that pilots can face, but these were the 4 that we're really focused on. Number 1, autokinesis, this idea that if a remote pilot is staring at a light like a star and it's against a unobviously black background, then the light will appear to move. Number 2, the false horizon. If you're looking at lights out into the distance, it will actually create the illusion that the horizon, those lights become the horizon, when in fact that's not the true horizon. Number 3, something called the reversible perspective, which you think an aircraft might be leaving or going away from you, but in fact it's approaching. This is an illusion, right? And the 4th one, flicker vertigo. Flickering lights can create this idea of imbalance and disorientation. Vertigo, right? Like dizziness. Maybe we've suffered from that. So 4 night illusions there. Talking about night time flying, some things we should be familiar with. Rods and cones in your eyes. Cones are responsible for color, the central part of your looking. And rods are more like peripheral vision, non-color, detecting movement from the side of your eye, right? Peripheral vision. The basic anatomy of your eye, cornea, lens, retina, and some numbers here. It is a good idea to wait about 7 minutes. And within that first 7 minutes of nighttime flying, you can switch to your peripheral vision. That's when your rods apparently are fully activated, or better than the vision that the cones are able to detect. And it takes about 25 to 30 minutes before your rods are at their maximum nighttime ability. In other words, maximum night vision happens around 30 minutes or so. What else can I tell you about on my notes about nighttime flying? Well, a controlled airport is only controlled during operation. You might want to check the hours. In fact, you should check the hours. There might be a question on the test about what kind of airspace this airport might become when the control tower hours are closed. So they'll have to look in the chart supplement there, figure out, okay, what time is it open and what time is it closed, right? Because at nighttime, the airspace can actually change after the tower closes. And the supplement will tell you that. It'll say like, well, this airspace is like, class C, and then after hours when the tower closes, it becomes class G, for example. Nighttime flying, you need air traffic control approval for class B, C, D, and E2 airspace. This is airspace primarily for the airport, the E2, primarily for the airport from surface, starting at the surface, and is primarily outlined by a dash magenta line. This is the E2 airspace. If your E2 or your Echo, class Echo, is an extension of class C or D, they say you don't need any air traffic control approval. Just B, C, D, and Echo 2. So to fly at night, you have to have your initial updated test like I did. I recently took it, which was after, I think it was like March or April of 2021. Well into 2022 I took mine, so that already includes nighttime flying and the remote ID parts of the test. So you need to take that, or the recurrent training. If you have not taken your initial test that included that, in other words, before 2021, you'll need to take the recurrent training that reflects the information about nighttime flying, flying over people, and remote ID information. And to fly at night, of course, anti-collision lights must be installed with a minimum visible distance of 3 statute miles. So according to Part 107, you can fly at night over people and vehicles without a waiver if the requirements are met. Again, you still need authorization for a controlled airspace flight at night. All right, another random fact here in the Part 107. If an authority approaches you, if you're out flying your drone, and they ask you, so this is like federal, state government, local government, law enforcement, or the TSA, or anybody from the FAA or the National Transportation Safety Board. If they approach you when you're out flying or doing a mission or something, they can ask you for your pilot certificate and your ID. All right, let's talk about part 89, which is information pertaining to the remote ID, or RID. So you need to know that acronym, RID, remote ID. And this can apply to a home-built drone, which is apparently defined by educational or recreational purposes. And you also need a declaration of compliance, or that you need to know what that is, I should say, a DOC. This is a letter submitted indicating record of compliance to the FAA regarding remote ID compliance. And I believe this comes from the manufacturer. Okay, so there are 3 ways apparently that you can be compliant with remote ID. Number 1, you can buy a drone that has RID installed or pre-installed on it. Number 2, you can buy an RID module and install it as a kind of a separate thing, attach it to your drone. Or number 3, you can fly in this area called a FRIA, F-R-I-A. But the idea is that any unmanned aircraft is or will be required to register, and it should have RID capability. I don't know if we're there yet. At the time of me taking this test, that's not something that apparently is done. But for example, if you have a drone that's under 55 pounds, this is part 107. You'll need to register it and have RID compliance. Or if you're flying recreationally and your drone is between 250 grams and 55 pounds, or less than 55 pounds, that is something that needs to have RID compliance as well. And most public safety must comply. Drones flown for public safety. But the federal government does not, from what I read. An unmanned aircraft for research purposes are exempt from showing compliance here, but they still may need RID, a RID module installed, or fly in a FRIA. And RID must work. It basically is going to go through kind of a when you turn on your drone, it'll go through a pre-installation to make sure that it works, right? And you're not able to turn the remote ID off. That's the idea, right? That it is able to track location and all kinds of stuff. And that would be a question to ask. What information does the RID transmit publicly? The serial number of your drone. This is related to the remote ID. The serial number of your RID module that you install has to be attached to the registration. And if you're flying for part 107, you need only 1 module per unmanned aircraft, or I should say 1 registration per unmanned aircraft or per module. You can only use 1 module for your drone. You have to buy another module if you have 2 drones, 2 modules if you're flying for part 107, as I understand it. If you're flying for recreational only, you can register only 1 RID module and use that across many drones. You might want to check me on that, but that is my understanding of it. So the RID, the remote ID, can show altitude at geometric, not barometric pressure, because there's not, basically the module is too small to hold barometric pressure to measure that. It can detect and transmit velocity, your latitude and longitude, time, and serial number, perhaps. Not sure if that goes out publicly or not, but certainly the authorities could check that if they needed to. FRIAs are approved. You have to apply to those. They're approved for 48 months. All right, now flying over people, if you're interested in doing that, there are some regulations you need to be aware of. There are 4 categories, and your drone will be kind of a drone is categorized into one of these 4 areas, 4 categories. And again, you can Google search or YouTube search flying over people. There's a great video out there, like I mentioned earlier, from the Pilot Institute that explains all of this. But essentially, Category 1 is for drones less than 0.55 pounds. You're not allowed to have any pieces that might lacerate, no lacerations. This Category 1 drone can fly over people anywhere, but it cannot be sustained over open air unless you are RID compliant. And that is difficult to do. Category 2 and 3, those are less than 55 pounds. Again, no laceration. They use something called kinetic energy. So like a Category 2 cannot produce more than 11 pounds of kinetic energy. Basically, the bigger it is, the harder it falls, right? And they don't want a drone falling under somebody. And a Category 3 requires or has a maximum poundage of kinetic energy at 25. So max 25 pounds of kinetic energy, which, as I understand it, basically these have to have parachutes installed on them in order to meet those regulations, which I don't think manufacturers are there yet, but maybe coming down the pipeline. And you can, fly these anywhere, but not sustained over open air, people that are gathering, unless RID compliant. And Category 4 is basically airworthiness certificate. So things that are above 55 pounds, those are your big drones, right? Flying over vehicles, it's important to know that a bike, a scooter, a roller skates, a boat, roller skates, boats, all of these are considered vehicles. And there are regulations that determine whether or not you can fly over a vehicle. For example, you must meet all Category 1, 2, and 3 requirements and be flying in a closed restricted area. You have to tell people, hey, I'm flying over you, and no sustained flight over the vehicle. But again, you can Google and YouTube search, can I fly over vehicles? Right? What a great question to ask. So I don't have all the answers here. These are just random facts and giving you some things to think about. Again, the idea is that these are my study notes. This is what I kind of remembered, and it served me really well. Another fact, looking at the image of an airplane from a bird's eye view, and let's say the airplane is pointed in the picture, the nose is north. Okay, so imagine you're kind of over the airplane, and you're flying over the airplane, and you're looking down, and you're flying with it, right? Well, on the left side of the airplane is going to be a red light, not green. The red light will be on the left, and green to the right. So that's how you can always tell if an aircraft is coming towards you or away from you, right? If you are on the ground and you see some blinking lights, red and green, red's on the left, green is on the right, well, then you know the aircraft is going away from you. However, if it's inversed, right, if the green is on the left and the red is on the right, then the aircraft is coming toward you. That would be important information to know if you are out flying your drone and you're not sure whether or not a manned aircraft is approaching. TSA does a background check on you after you pass your test and apply for your pilot license. That is done by TSA. All right, some other random facts here for you. Class B airspace. On a sectional chart, you will identify this because it's a blue solid line. And it'll tell you on the chart usually what the floor and the ceiling are. You don't have to memorize that. Same with Class C airspace, but this is a solid magenta, not blue. Solid magenta is Class C airspace. And it should tell you. For example, surface to 4,000 feet. And by the way, Class B and C are measured in MSL, not AGL, on a chart. MSL, mean sea level. Class D also means sea level. Class D is identified on a sectional chart by a dashed blue circle. Dashed blue, think that, right? D, Class D for dashed. Okay, and it should tell you as well. It might not tell you the surface that's implied, but it has a little dashed box around this number, like 25, for example. If you see a little dashed box 25 inside a dashed blue circle, that should indicate that from the surface all the way up to 2,500 feet MSL, that's your floor and your ceiling. So that would be controlled airspace, right? Class B, Class C, Class D, controlled airspace. Class E on a sectional chart has 3 different and maybe even more. Class E is your wild card here. Class E, we'll start with dashed magenta. Dashed magenta, like around an airport, for example, tells you from the surface to 700 feet. And this is AGL, not MSL. AGL is controlled airspace. Faded magenta around an airspace tells you that floor starts at 700. 700. Anything under that, you're good to go. Usually Class G. And shaded blue, I didn't see any of shaded blue on my test, but could also be Class E. And that has a floor that starts at 1,200 feet AGL. And also the Victor Airways, the major highways in the sky, so to speak. If you've seen these like blue pathways coming in and out of airports, those are also Class E airspace with, they have certain widths. I think they're 8 miles in width, but they are basically floors of 1,200 feet AGL. Class E airspace are those as well. And Class G is uncontrolled. You can definitely watch videos on airspace. I'm no pro. I highly recommend you spend a lot of time with airspace identification, understanding what they are and how to find them on a sectional map. Remember, a blue airport on a sectional chart has a control tower and a magenta does not. MSL means mean sea level, and this number is always going to be higher on a sectional chart than AGL number, which is above ground level number. So in italics, you might see, okay, this is the elevation of this tower. It's in italics, and it might say like, 2,500, and that means MSL, so above sea level. But right below it in parentheses, you'll see the AGL number, which tells you the ground level, right? How far above the ground level does this tower go? And so the MSL number is always going to be a little higher or higher than the AGL number. So that's important to know. How do you find an MSL number versus an AGL number on a sectional chart? Because the test will be tricky. Some of the answers will be, MSL or AGL, so you have to be able to find that. Okay, moving right along. A facility map. Do you know what a facility map is? This is online. It shows you kind of like a sectional chart, but by far less detail. It shows the maximum altitude that you're able to fly. So you can Google that question or YouTube search that question. Facility maps. That's important. I also was prepared to know that foreigners, as somebody who comes here from another country to fly, it's apparently pretty difficult for them to fly recreationally, but they could potentially take the Part 107 test, plus all the normal requisites or requirements. But they also have to apply for something called an economic authority. I don't know if it's a certificate or a waiver or what do you call it, but something from the economic authority, or apply to the economic authority, which is from, I believe, the Department of Transportation. But just know there's something extra that foreigners have to apply for if they want to fly in the U.S. If you pass your Part 107 test, you'll be issued your temporary license, which is valid for 120 days. 120 days. All right, to register your drone, you have to be a citizen or a permanent resident, and you register on the Drone Zone, that FAA website called the Drone Zone. Your registration will expire in 3 years to the day. 3 years to the day. You will have 30 days to update any changes to your address. So let's say you move and you had registered. You'll need to go onto Drone Zone and update your address. You have 30 days to be in compliance with that. You cannot, or your drone cannot be registered in a foreign country as well. Doesn't work. The unique identifier, which basically is your FAA registration number, must be displayed in a legible way, affixed to really any means necessary. It can't fall off. It can't require any special tools to access this FAA number. It has to be on an external surface. There's no font requirements for this. You have to be 13 years or older to register it. Otherwise, a parent basically or a guardian has to register it on your behalf. But 13 is the minimum age to register your drone. If you're just flying recreationally, you don't have to register your drone if it weighs below 250 grams. And if you are flying for Part 107 and you have many drones, you'll have to register each drone and get a unique identifying number for each drone to attach to it. Okay, did you know that Part 107 has a clause that exempts flyers from the rules if they're flying for recreational purposes only? That is, the intent of the flight is only for recreational purposes. So if I have my Part 101 certificate, I'm able to fly recreationally, but not necessarily vice versa. The recreational exemption is known by the number 44809, and you are required, if you're just flying recreationally, to follow the community-based organization's guidelines, maintain visual level of sight, not exceed 400 feet AGL, and of course you have to rock your trust test. This is something I did before I studied for my Part 107. It's like a 45-minute training. Trust stands for something I don't know, but you can Google that. And it's all online. It's free. You can't fail it. It's pretty easy to do. Okay, other facts. Class A airspace is more restrictive than Class B. Class B is more restrictive than Class C. Class C is more restrictive than Class D, etc. You cannot operate a drone from a moving aircraft. That's pretty much a flat-out policy. But you can operate it from a land vehicle or a water vehicle like a boat, but only over a sparsely populated area, and you cannot be transporting any property for compensation or hire while doing so. If you fail your Part 107 test, you have to wait 14 days before you can take that again. Striking wildlife is not mandatory to report. Voluntarily report it only. Okay, you should definitely be able to identify CTAF on a sectional chart and what it's for, right? You are not allowed to transport hazardous materials whatsoever on your drone. The pilot in command can only operate one drone at a time. This is maybe a little obvious, but there may be a question there on the test. Only one at a time. Generally, just don't fly in P or R areas, so prohibited or restricted areas. The maximum speed that your drone is legally allowed to fly is 100 miles per hour. 100 miles per hour. And they might trick you here a little bit because the equivalent of 100 miles per hour is 87 knots. And know that there might be some tricks, right? It might say like 87 miles per hour as an option. Well, no, it's not 87 miles per hour. It's 100 miles per hour. If you refuse to take an alcohol test or a drug test, or if you have any drug or alcohol offenses, that can both merit 1 year of denial of your application wait time or a suspension of your license altogether. All right, spare batteries. So at the end of your FAA study guide, there will be some study guide references to mentioning lithium batteries. So basically spare batteries, the lithium ion battery, you cannot check it, in your carry-on or at the gate or in your checked luggage or anything like that. Each must be individually protected. Each battery cannot exceed 2 grams or 100 watt hours. So 2 grams, 100 watt hours per battery. They have to be individually protected, like I said, taped. The exposed terminals have to be taped, and they have to be in a separate pouch or bag, like the original case or a transporting case. The metal cannot come in contact at all. And basically what they want you to know there is that something called thermal runaway can happen, which is like a short, right? Because of temperatures, or if you overcharge it, or just through like a really old battery, and that can create a massive uncontrollable fire. And they obviously don't want you to be doing that. They even had they tried to do a test and contain it, and it was very difficult to do. So there are no approved containers that can actually stop such a fire or an explosion resulting from a battery that has experienced thermal runaway. Temperatures can burn up to 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. But you are supposed to use halon or I've never heard that before, halon or water, not ice, to extinguish it, because ice can act as a thermal insulator and actually make temperatures rise faster and have a opposite effect of trying to contain the fire. All right, another fact for you. TFRs are issued by NOTAMs. You should know what an isogonic line is on a sectional chart, and an agonic line. So an isogonic line, the line showing the magnetic variation between true north and magnetic north. And there's a great video I found on YouTube that kind of explains what the difference between true and magnetic north are. Basically, your compass might be pointing to magnetic north, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's true north. They're at different, those two north points are different. They're not the same exact point. All right, you need anti-collision lights to fly at night, and also during civil twilight. So that's 30 minutes before sunrise and 30 minutes after sunset, right? Civil twilight. Anti-collision lights, basically anytime during the day you don't need anti-collision lights, but as soon as official sunset or sunrise happen, you need to put those on. Basically, sunset happens, you need to put those on during civil twilight, and then after civil twilight all night. So 2 in the morning if you're flying, those anti-collision lights need to be on, and then 30 minutes before sunrise they still need to be on, and then sunrise happens, you can take them off once sunrise happens. Pretty common sense, I think. They want you to know that 1,000 feet or less is a wire-rich environment, so you need to be really careful when you're flying for various wires, whether they're guy wires or they're power lines, right? Our world is filled with wires. So be careful, especially at night when flying in these areas. Now, to sit for your license, or your test, I should say, and then to subsequently apply for your pilot's license, your remote pilot license, Part 107, you need to be 16 years of age. Think like working legally in the U.S. Like I remember my first job was when I was 16, right? Because I could legally work then. There may be some stipulations to that, but that's what helped me learn. You have to speak English, meant to be mentally and physically fit to, fly a drone and to pass the 107 test. A hangover can have booze in your body, alcohol still in the body, up to 16 hours. So be careful when you're out flying the next day. It takes 3 hours to rid the body to rid itself of one beer, generally speaking. So one thing I was aware of, one little fact that I learned, if you're flying over a national wildlife refuge, then you should not fly lower than 2,000 feet AGL. This is a number that I memorized. It's not exactly convenient for wildlife and animals if there are drones flying and, you can hear them, right? Drones are pretty loud, so 2,000 feet AGL, no lower than. I was aware that there were altimeter variations between weather reporting points because there are unequal heating patterns of the Earth's surface, right? So that can, as your drone flies over, parts of the Earth's surface, there could be some variation in terms of your altimeter there because, again, there are different heating points coming up, and I'll mention those again later. The ceiling for a cloud, if it's at 700 feet, for example, that means you can only fly up to 200 feet AGL because the requirement is you're not allowed to fly within 500 feet below clouds. So 700 minus 500 there would be 200. So again, the ceiling 200 feet, you can only fly within 500 feet of that 700-foot cloud ceiling. So that means you can really only fly up to 200 feet. When your TAF or your METAR says the cloud ceiling is 700 feet. Class E is measured in AGL. The other classes, airspace classifications, seem to be measured in MSL. All right, left downwind. What does that mean? Well, planes typically land going and take off into the wind. So if you say left downwind, the plane is landing in an upwind pattern. But if another pilot is self-positioning and saying, I'm left downwind, then that means they're heading in the opposite direction. Think like oncoming car, right? As the landing or taking off pilot. Pilots typically, when they take off and land, the pattern is to the left. Not always, it can be to the right depending on the runway. But just think of, okay, a pilot's landing into the wind. To the left of that, parallel to this pilot landing or taking off, is the downwind, right? So the pilot is kind of circling around, preparing a descent, a land, possibly. So if the runway is like runway 16, which means the runway is pointed toward 160 degrees, then a left downwind pilot, what's their heading? 160 degrees, the same as the runway? No. They are heading in the opposite direction. So the opposite heading would be 340 degrees in this case. So MEF, I don't think I got a question on this, but this stands for maximum elevation figure. You can Google that or YouTube search that. But my understanding is that it's the minimum altitude that you can fly given a quadrangle to clear obstacles. So like terrain and obstructions. And that maximum number is rounded up to the 100. Rounded up plus added 100 feet extra. Blue lines, I mentioned highway in the skies, Victor Airways. These are always Class E airspace, as I understand it, with a base of 1,200 or a floor of 1,200 feet AGL. You can generally not fly directly over a non-participating person who's not under safe cover. A pilot in command can use corrective lenses to visually see, to maintain a line of sight with the drone, but nothing else. In other words, it has to be unaided, right? So you can't just use binoculars, for example. You can if it increases the operational or enhances the operation. If you need to like see something really quick, you can use binoculars, but you can't like rely on them to maintain your visual line of sight. You can lose sight briefly for safety reasons or operational necessity. So if you're flying your drone and you need to look down, or you need to look at something, move out of the way of something. If a car's coming at you, obviously that's for safety reasons, right? Shouldn't be flying a drone in the street, but you see the point. You can, look away if you need be, but get your eyes back up on the drone is what they want you to know, and you have to be able to see it with your eyes, and your corrective lenses, perhaps if you wear contacts or glasses. A person not having a license or certificate may operate the controls, the drone, right, for hire, but only under the direct supervision of the pilot in command that is certified, right? And the pilot in command has to be able to be right there to take immediate control of the drone if need be. So a standard day or standard, the word standard, when you see this or hear this, you need to know that the temperature on a standard day is 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. And the barometric pressure is 29.92. So on a standard day, your pressure altitude and your density altitude are basically equal. Density and pressure are directly proportional with one another, which means if density goes up, pressure goes up, and vice versa. Density and temperature are inversed, so density goes up when the temperature goes down. Density goes down when the temperature goes up. So think like when it gets hotter, right? The air molecules expand, they push outward from one another, and the density becomes less. Whereas if it gets colder, think like bundling up, right? You get colder, you kind of compact, so the air molecules compact and become more dense, and that increases with high density, right? It increases the drone performance. So in colder temperatures, your drone will generally perform a little better in that regard because the air is more dense, and not as well, it won't perform as well when the temperatures are a little higher and the density is not as high. So when altitude increases, the temperature kind of decreases, the pressure decreases, and density also generally decreases. So think you launch that drone and it goes up, several hundred feet. Well, the temperatures are going to get colder up there. There's not going to be as much pressure, and the density won't be as good, right? Which means less performance. The higher you go, the harder it is for your drone to perform. Altitude, I was familiar with 5 different types of altitude. Absolute altitude, which is basically, think A, absolute, your altitude above AGL, above ground level. So if you've got, I'm thinking like a manned aircraft and you see something that says absolute, your absolute altitude is, it's going to tell you, that number will essentially tell you how far above ground you are at that moment. True altitude is how far you are above sea level, mean sea level, right? True altitude. Altitude above mean sea level. Indicated altitude is what your altimeter displays, your indicated altitude. So whatever number's on your altimeter. Pressure altitude is your altitude when the barometric pressure is 29.29. Pressure altitude. And density altitude is your altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. So again, when you're not at 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit, or your barometric pressure is not at 29.29, it's a corrected number. So this would happen maybe, I think, if you're in the mountains, what would be the kind of the equivalent density that your aircraft would be? How does the density of the air actually affect the performance of the drone at this altitude? So in order for your drone or an aircraft to climb, it needs thrust and power, right? And if weight is added, then it needs a higher angle of attack to maintain the altitude and the speed. But if you have a higher angle of attack, this can actually increase the drag on the vehicle, and you consequently need more thrust to overcome that drag. That was a concept that I learned. I also watched a YouTube video on the angle of attack. What is it? Because it was something I couldn't understand by reading the instruction manual, right? What the heck is an angle of attack? So there's a couple of great videos out there. Just YouTube search angle of attack. Convective currents. I was familiar with the idea that soil and rocks and sand and roads, these things that exist out there on the landscape and terrain, actually radiate heat and can create updrafts. I mentioned earlier that the Earth has the surface has unequal heating patterns, right? And that can affect your altimeter variations on your device, right? So if you're flying over, a road, a hot concrete road that's been baking under the sun, you might experience an updraft if you're flying your drone over it. That's important to know, right? Because it's radiating heat upward. Inversely, convective currents can also, like a lake or an ocean or a tree, can absorb heat. So in that case, you might experience some downdrafts. If you're flying over, I don't know if you fly over water very often or if you should, but you might experience some downdrafts occurring because they are absorbing heat. So that was an interesting concept to me, this idea that the Earth just sitting there, because it's absorbing heat or radiating heat, it can create circulation and turbulence. There doesn't even have to be any external wind coming in, right? It can just create its own turbulence and wind, for example. And this is particularly true with a lower altitude and warmer weather. Adiabatic heating and cooling is this idea that air rises, or when it does, it expands and it cools, right? And then the air will descend and it'll compress and warm. So the difference here between air rising and cooling and the temperature at which it does this is called the lapse rate, and it's a rate of temperature change, right? And the average is kind of 2 degrees Celsius per 1,000 feet. And if it occurs more than that, then that can be an indicator of, okay, we have more unstable air happening, right? Because air is rising and falling, it's heating and cooling at a faster rate, and that can affect the stability of the air. So that was something that I learned as well. Any weather change is a result of a heat exchange. I was also familiar with polar air masses and tropical air masses. This idea that, when weather brings cool, dry air into the area, that's going to be like a polar air mass. And warm, moist air is a tropical air mass moving into the area. I knew what a cold front was. It's like this fast snowplow-like front, this movement of cold air. It can create storms and winds and turbulence. A warm front, which is basically increasing humidity coming in, warm air coming in that can increase humidity and rain. An occluded front, which is a cold front catching a warm front, as I understand it. And a stationary front, which is a slow front catching a slow front. In other words, the fronts are the same. It's called a stationary front. I didn't get any questions on those, but another fact, a tailwind that changes to a headwind. What do you think? Would that increase or decrease speed and performance of your aircraft? Well, usually when I think of like a headwind when I'm driving a car, I think this is a problem because it negatively affects gas mileage and whatnot, and I just don't like it, right? Harder to control, but that's apparently not true with a drone or an aircraft. A headwind is actually better. It helps the relative air wind go over the wing a little better. I mentioned earlier pilots land and take off into the wind, and that's a good thing. Tailwinds can be dangerous, especially with like microbursts. It can push the aircraft in ways that you don't want it to go and be quite dangerous. So when a tailwind changes to a headwind, this will actually increase the speed and the performance of the aircraft. A microburst, severe low-level wind shear, and it's expected in a temperature inversion. I knew what evaporation was. I think everybody knows what evaporation is, right? When water changes into vapor. Sublimation is when a solid like ice changes into water vapor. I didn't know what that was, but evaporation and sublimation are two ways where we can take and create water vapor that's added to the atmosphere, right? So think of like a pool of water and a bucket of ice. Well, the water can evaporate and go into the atmosphere, and the ice experiences sublimation, and that ice will change directly to water vapor. That's a concept. And conversely, the water vapor can be put back into liquid form or solid form through condensation. Everybody knows what that is. Cold glass of water in a warm environment will experience condensation, right? So water vapor comes back into water through condensation, and water vapor can go back into a solid like ice, for example, through deposition. Deposition, I believe, is the word. Water vapor back to ice. Cumulonimbus clouds, CB clouds on your TAF and your meters. These are dangerous clouds indicative of squall lines, frontal bands, pretty dangerous stuff. An air mass or a thunderstorm is usually associated with your cumulonimbus clouds. Lenticular clouds can also create strong turbulence, but these are clouds that are created because apparently there's barriers in the wind flow around mountaintops. So there's little movements. They're kind of smooth and circular, but can be indicative of strong turbulence. Okay, I didn't need to know this, but I did because I thought it was kind of interesting. If you're trying to determine the cloud base, so if you look outside and you see some clouds and it's overcast, and you're thinking, okay, what is the cloud base? Well, you can apparently calculate this from what I read, and this is how I studied this part. So what is the temperature and the dew point right now? Okay, so if it's the same value, fog will occur, right? Because the air particles have reached their maximum. They cannot absorb any more water, apparently. The difference between the temperature and the dew point is called the spread. So if the temperature is 75 degrees Fahrenheit and the dew point is 70 degrees Fahrenheit, then the spread would be 5. Now, to calculate the cloud base, if you are measuring these two in Fahrenheit, then you would have to divide this number by 4.4, which would give you a number of 1.14. And then you multiply it by 1,000, And voila, you have the cloud base 1,140 feet, and that is AGL. Advection fog. 5 types of fog that I was familiar with. Number 1, advection fog, associated with coastal and sea breezes. Warm air over cold air with wind, but the wind can't be too strong. 15 knots or lower is required. And this happens during the days, apparently. Radiation fog happens on clear nights and no wind is required. Can happen in valleys, and the ground cools rapidly and burns off with the sun. Upslope fog. Mountain slopes. It occurs on mountain slopes. Upslope fog makes sense, right? Moist, stable air increases or blows upward, and it does require wind. So that's 2 types of fog that require wind. The advection fog, remember, and upslope fog. Remember that. Steam fog is basically sea smoke. So you have cold, dry air coming over warm water, and it evaporates and creates a little bit of ice, some turbulence. Steam fog. Next and last type of fog, ice fog. It's below freezing. Water vapor turns to ice crystals. Happens generally in valleys. So that's 2 types of fogs that have happened in valleys, right? Radiation fog, I mentioned, happens in valleys. And ice fog. But it's cold. Negative 25 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. That's pretty cold. Oh, here's an interesting one for you. Runway 22. Pointed in which direction? What's the heading? 220 degrees, right? Just add a 0. But is this magnetic or is it true north? Or true the direction on a compass, magnetic or not? Is it true? So for example, if you had the answers and it said 220 magnetic or 220 true, which runway is runway 22? That one was tough for me. I didn't get a question on that, but I definitely was prepared for it. Came across this in a practice test. The answer is magnetic. So runways are laid out by magnetic north, not true north. Okay, so think about that if you're looking at a compass, they will position the runway and name the runway 16, runway whatever, based on magnetic, not true. But meters and taffs. So for example, if you see a meter and a taff and it says 180.04 KT, so 180 would be the direction, 180 degrees at 4 knots, right? Easy, right? But what if the answer said true? Is it 180 degrees true north or true? It's not north, but true or magnetic? Well, in this case, in meters and taffs, the wind direction is reported in true, not magnetic. So the correct answer would be 180 degrees true at 4 knots. Interesting, right? That is something I memorized. Another fact for you, planes join the traffic pattern at 45 degrees to the downwind. They wouldn't enter at the base of the pattern. That would be too close to the runway. They join the traffic at 45 degrees to downwind. I was familiar with the term called the moment. The moment. It's a physics term. I hadn't seen it before. The moment. And think of like a teeter-totter, right? You have the middle of the teeter-totter, the balance point. And on one side, you'll have the moment. On the other side, the moment. And the moments have to equal each other in order for that teeter-totter to be balanced. This is important when you're loading your drone or aircraft, right? You don't want to tilt one side too far to the left or to the right. You want it to be as equal as possible so it doesn't affect the flight, right? So I was familiar with terms like the datum, D-A-T-U-M, and the fulcrum. And basically, if you're given a number, like if you have 12 pounds on one side of the teeter-totter and you've got 4 pounds on the other side of the teeter-totter, how far away does that 4 pounds need to be from the from the middle of the point? And the answer is 3 inches, because 4 times 3 equals 12. So there's a mathematical calculation there. The weight times the distance equals the moment. And the moment on the right and the moment on the left have to be equal. You might get a question about that. Another fact, category 2 and 3. We talked about flying over people earlier. You need a declaration of compliance, among many other things, but that's important. I memorized that. The airport altitude, is that in MSL or AGL, do you think? So if you see the altitude on a sectional chart of the airport, MSL or AGL? Correct answer is MSL. But the cloud ceiling is always AGL, not MSL for a cloud ceiling. Microbursts can last 15 minutes, up to 15 minutes. The basic empty weight of an aircraft, if it's 12 pounds and your maximum takeoff weight is 18 pounds, then what is the useful load? 6 pounds. So basic empty weight, max takeoff weight, and useful load. So you would just minus the max takeoff weight from the basic empty weight to equal the useful load. I was familiar with that. Scanning techniques, 30 degrees, 2 or 3 seconds, stopping at for 2 or 3 seconds, and then overlapping the previous about 10 degrees before you continue with your next 30 degrees when you're visually inspecting for aircraft around your drone. If you are convicted for a drug offense, your application can be denied for up to 1 year. Your serial number on your drone must be on your certificate of registration with your RID, your remote ID. Be really careful. Pay attention to degrees of north and west, latitude and longitude in the answers. It might be trying to trick you, right? You might have the two numbers like 107 and 39. Is it north or west or north? Which number goes with which? That fooled me on a practice test. And again, your test booklet that will be given to you will have lots of things in it that you don't have to memorize, but you should be aware that it will be in there in case there's a question on it. You can quickly go to it. You know where to find it. That will be efficient and help you with time. All right, good luck to you. Don't forget to check out all of the links in the description below, the flashcards, the condensed notes on the FAA's original study guide, and you'll do great. Relax and have a little fun. Thanks so much for being with me, and hopefully this has helped you out.